The Summary channel. In this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. The energy ceasefire has finished and the Russians have intensified their activities significantly. Just during the previous night, between this 1st and the 2nd of February of 2026, the Russians used 172 drones to attack the territory of Ukraine. The sources are saying that the Russians were attacking not just the logistic of Ukraine or military objects. The Russians were also attacking objects of critical and energy infrastructure. So if we compare this night with the previous nights, we might see a huge difference. For example, between the 31st of January and the 2nd of February, the Russians used just 90 drones, so it's almost 2 times less. As for the night between the 30th and the 31st of January, the Russians used 85 drones. So as you can see, during the energy ceasefire, the Russians used 2 times less drones in comparison with previous night, which means that the Russians are preparing themselves for something, and we understand what we are talking about. We are talking about another massive attack on the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. Russia has already identified Kiev and their surrounding region as the primary target of the attack on the nights of February between 2nd and 3rd of February, according to monitoring sources. Adversary analysts report that the Russian army is redeploying strategic aircraft between airfields in preparation for a massive missile and drone strike. So the sources are trying to tell us that either between the 2nd and 3rd of February of 2026 or between 3rd and 4th of February of 2026, the Russians are going to carry out another massive missile and drone attack through the entire territory of Ukraine with just one purpose: to destroy the energy infrastructure of the city of Kiev. And I would like to remind you that according to Zelensky, Ukraine's meeting with Russia and the United States will held on Wednesday and Thursday in the Emirates like last time. This is already an agreement that was stated by Zelensky. So according to this, we say that the Russians most likely are going to attack the territory of Ukraine a day or 2 days before the beginning of this meeting, and this is going to mean something like additional pressure on Zelensky with the purpose to force him to accept Russia's demands. Furthermore, we start receiving very interesting articles published by the Western media. A peace agreement needs to be signed because Ukraine is exhausted, says head of the Nikolaev region. So this is not somebody outside Ukraine. We are talking about this region in the southern part of Ukraine. This is the Nikolaev region, and the head of this region stated that it's time to to make a deal. It's time to make a deal with Russians, and it's time to make a deal with Russians. And we are not talking about the borders of 1991. First of all, the head of this region is trying to tell us that it is important to have security guarantees and to finish the war. So this is the situation. We see that the situation is critical. At least it's critical for Zelensky and his plans to probably continue the war until of the borders of 1991. Another important thing, as for the current status and current situation with energy infrastructure in Ukraine, there are still lots of power stations that operate. For example, here we can see the satellite picture of the Burштynska power plant. As you can see, the power plant is working, is operating. This is the situation in the city of Lvov. The power stations of the city of Lvov is operating. This is the satellite picture of the Kharkiv or Zmiev power station, and this power station is also operating. As for the power station through Ukraine, according to information we have, just one of them was destroyed, and we're talking about the power station of the city of Kiev number 6. The sources are saying that this power station will not be able to restore even after the end of the war. Another important thing, the Russians during the previous 24 hours, as we discussed, launched around 172 drones, and the sources are saying that the Russians were attacking significantly the city of Konotop. This is one of the most important cities when talking about the logistics in the northern part of Ukraine, because there are railways that go in the direction of the most northeastern parts of Ukraine and in the direction of the city of Sumy. So the Russians attacked this territory most likely with the purpose to destroy the Ukraine's logistics and not to allow the Ukrainians to redeploy additional forces to the line of combat contact. And you know that during the previous 24 hours we received changes in this area. I would like to remind you that since the beginning of January, we have received lots of updates that the Russians began advancing in the most northeastern part of this region, and during the previous 12 hours, additional sources confirmed that the Russians indeed managed to improve their positions and to capture additional forest and additional positions on the Ukrainian side of the border. So these are the changes on the ground between the 31st of January and the 2nd of February. The Russians are keeping advancing, and as you can see, this area is located right along the railways that go from the city of Kiev through the settlement of Konotop in the northeastern direction. So most likely the Ukrainians were trying to redeploy additional forces with the purpose to stabilize the situation along MO2 road, but the Russians attacked the train. Another important attack took place in the area of the city by the name of Pavlograd. During the previous night, pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians attacked the settlements of Ternivka and targets in Vasilievka, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. And the sources are saying that the Russians attacked the Ternivka coal mine. So the Ukrainians still produce coal for the power station purposes, and the Russians decided to attack this coal mine with the purpose to collapse, to destroy the production of this resource, and which will obviously lead to the situation when the Ukrainian power station will not receive additional resources for generation of power and electricity. So this mine was attacked. It's very difficult to understand whether the Russians managed to deal critical damage or not, but it was just the first night of attack, which means that Russians will continue. Now let's return back and let's continue with the Sumy direction. During the previous 12 hours, very huge and interesting changes were recorded. And first, let's talk about the southeastern direction of the city of Sumy. During the previous 12 hours, additional changes on the ground were recorded. Pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians entered the settlement of Pokrovka, and based on this report, pro-Ukrainian sources adjusted the map. They expanded a gray zone to the west of the settlement of Kolotilovka from the Russian side. So very interesting. This is a very interesting direction, and as you can see, the pro-Ukrainian sources added a very huge gray zone, and this gray zone covers more than 50% of the settlement of Pokrovka, which means that there are very heavy clashes and the Russians are trying to dig in deeper. So during the January of 2026, the Russians were advancing in the area of these villages of Grabovska and Ryasne. We discussed the situation as well, and now we see that there are like two roads of attacks, and both roads of attacks are moving in one direction, and we are talking about the settlement of Krasnopolye. It seems that the Russians are about to increase their attempts or intensify their attempts to establish complete control over the settlement of Krasnopolye and to begin the preparation of another foothold to attack the city of Sumy, but this time from the south and from the southeast. So this is a very dangerous situation for the armed forces of Ukraine. Let's wait and see what is going to be next, but this might be a very dangerous once again for Ukrainians. As for the Kharkiv direction, during the previous 12 hours, additional changes were recorded. I would like to remind you that just yesterday, pro-Russian sources published this article. The Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and the Group of Forces North reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians established complete control over the settlement by the name of Zelena. So based on those reports, yesterday we adjusted the maps. They received additional changes. According to new updates, the Russians continue advancing in the area of the city of Volchansk along the river of Seversky Donets in the southern direction, and the Russians improved their positions around the villages of Semenovka and Gravskaya. So these are the changes on the ground between the dates. It seems that in coming days or even hours, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm Russian control over the settlement of Gravskaya. And furthermore, according to neutral mappers, the Russians during the previous days improved their positions significantly in the area of the villages of Volchansky Hutor, Pakaya Lyana, and Zybina. As you can see, the Russians are about to establish complete control over this huge forest which is located along the border. So the Russians are keeping advancing further in the northeastern direction with the purpose to probably create a very powerful buffer zone along the border in the most northeastern part of the Kharkiv region. So we are talking about this red line. And then from these positions, the Russians most likely will continue offensive operation further deep inside of the Kharkiv region. As for the Kupiansk direction, during the previous 12 hours, additional changes were provided by neutral mappers. So it's still the situation here still remains very difficult to understand what is the exact status of the city of Kupiansk, because almost every single mapper shows his own picture of the city of Kupiansk and the territories around. So as of now, we are waiting for additional updates, but we have a new trend, we have new probably a direction. I'm trying to tell you that when talking about the previous months, most of the sources were saying that the Ukrainians launched a counter-offensive operation that forced the Russians to fall back. Now we have a different situation. Now most of the sources are trying to tell us that the Russians launched their offensive operation with the purpose to establish complete control over the city of Kupiansk and over the eastern bank of the river Voskol. And now everything is about this: how the Russians counter-attack Ukrainians and how Ukrainians are retreating from this area. So which means that now we will start to receiving more and more updates, but this time updates about additional control in Russian favor. As for the Slaviansk direction, during the previous 12 hours, we received a very important update. According to information we have, the armored forces of the Russian Federation managed to establish complete control over strongholds to the south of the settlement of Zakitna. This is a very important piece of news because this is let's say, territory between the settlement of Zakitna and the settlement of Krivoluka. We're talking about these hills is the most valuable positions through the entire direction, and who controls these hills probably controls the entire situation almost until the cities of Nikolaevka and Alexandrovka. So based on this report that was published by a neutral mapper, the armored forces of the Russian Federation managed to establish complete control over these two strongholds, and the Russians answered this elevation and these hills, which means that they will continue and they will keep on advancing further in the southern direction with the purpose to establish complete control over the territory, and the most powerful defense layer has been already captured, as you can see, by Russians. They will continue offensive. Once again, if Ukraine loses control over these hills, most likely they will be forced to fall back from the territory to the south. We are talking about the territory between the villages of Kalyenniki and Rezvinovka. The Ukrainians basically would be forced to fall back further in the western direction towards the settlement of Alexandrovka and towards these huge forests. They will try to stabilize the situation in this area at least for a while. At the same time, the Russians are keeping advancing along MO3 road, and during the previous 12 hours we received lots of very interesting updates. Some sources shown just routes of attacks of the armored forces of the Russian Federation, and some pro-Russian sources adjusted their maps. So according to the latest updates, the armored forces of the Russian Federation established complete control over the settlement by the name of Nikiforovka. As of now, we are waiting for additional updates. Maybe the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this, and when it happens, we will adjust the map. As we see that the Russians are approaching the settlement of Alexandrovka and they're getting closer and closer to the settlement, and which means that the battle for Slaviansk is inevitable in coming months. As for the Konstantinovka direction, during the previous 12 hours, additional changes on the ground were recorded. This is the end of the 1st of February. This is the beginning of the 2nd of February. The Russians, as we can see, established complete control over the residential areas in the eastern part of the settlement. And this information was confirmed based on the videos that were published by pro-Ukrainian sources. And here we can see how Ukrainians were attacking forces and units of the armored forces of the Russian Federation that were moving through this part of the city. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map. Once again, these are the changes, and furthermore, this information was confirmed by neutral mappers. So it seems that the Russians are moving further in the northern part of the city of Konstantinovka when talking about, let's say, the river of Krivoy Terets, and the Russians continue after withdrawing positions of the armored forces of Ukraine in the southern part. So the battle, as you can see, for the city of Konstantinovka continues. The Russians, according to the latest configuration of the map, control just 15 or 20% of the settlement, and they are still very far from the complete control over the settlement itself. Now let's talk about the Dobropolye direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the settlement of Sokhetska was captured by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Based on the report published by the Minister of Defense and based on the video published a bit further to the west of the settlement of Sokhetska, we have adjusted the map. Here we can see how Ukrainians were attacking sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the armed forces of the Russian Federation that were moving along the railways. So based on these updates, we have adjusted the map and we can see that the Russians are about to consolidate their positions along railways between the cities of Rodinska and Dorozhny, Novodonbass and Sokhetska. As soon as the Russians are able to establish complete control over the territories, you can see most of these territories have been considered as a gray zone, so we are waiting for additional updates and then the map will be adjusted, and this will allow the Russians to begin their major offensive operation towards the settlement of Biletska. Furthermore, today we start reports that Russians began advancing in the direction of the settlement of Biletska from the northeast, from the settlement of Dorozhny, trying to attack the Ukrainians from behind and trying to attack and to cut TO 515 road that connects the city of Biletska with the city of Dobropolye. As for the settlement of Dobropolye, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the settlement. As you can see, lots of buildings were already damaged and significantly destroyed and significantly damaged, and the Russians continue bombing and attacking the territory. This is the last stronghold, the last base, more or less big base of the armed forces of Ukraine in the northwestern and in the western parts of the Donbas region. If Ukraine loses control of Dobropolye, we won't see huge settlements in this area in the northwestern direction almost until the Lazov agglomeration. So the distance between the settlement of Dobropolye and the Lazov agglomeration is around 70 kilometers. So this gap is too big gap without big cities, towns and villages that could be used by Ukrainians as strongholds like the city of Pokrovsk used to be, Mirnograd or Dobropolye itself, which means that the Russians may move in this direction much faster in comparison with the territory in this region. As for the Zaporozhye direction, during the previous 12 hours, additional changes were recorded. The Russians are keeping advancing in the western Zaporozhye direction. They're trying to improve their positions around the settlement of Richne. The Russians are trying to advance from the, let's say, Novoyakovlevka towards the city of Orekhov in the eastern direction. And the Russians are trying to break through Ukraine's defense along the railways between the settlements of Zalizhnye, Verkhnya Tersa, Vozdvizhenka, and Rizdvinovka. So this is the third defense layer. The first defense layer was the river of Gaichur. The second defense layer was the railways, and the third defense layer is the territory between the settlements of, once again, Rizdvinka, Vozdvizhenka, Verkhnya Tersa, Staroukrainka, and Zaliznychne. So this is the third defense layer, and if Ukraine loses control over this third defense layer of the Zaporozhye city, of the Zaporozhye the direction, this will lead to completely unpredictable consequences for the city itself, and the Russians will be able to get the city much faster than we can expect. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.